Good evening. Once again, our best friend and one Owen Alterman, special senior international correspondent for I-24 News Israel. And I always try to get him at least once a month so that we can know about our darling Israel, because we are darlings in India and Israel. And I think what's going on there in terms of the corona, that is the Wuhan virus, then economy, politics, geopolitics, and geostrategy, especially with the change of guard there in Capitol Hill and White House. So, welcome, Owen.
Great to be here as always. Good to see you, Gulrez.
Lots of hugs from Indians.
Same here.
So, Owen, I came to know that you got your second dose of vaccine. Congratulations to you.
Thank you much. Got it yesterday. A little under the
Great.
weather, but doing better. It's all for a good cause, right? And I know you said you got your first
It's
dose,
for
right?
a good cause.
Slowly but
Yeah,
surely.
yeah. So, Owen, how's the vaccination drive going on there in Israel?
Well, what's there to say except that we are by far the best in the world?
Yeah, clap for you guys.
That's the bottom line. We have now 15% of the population that has had a second dose. So by this time next
Wow.
week, 15% of the population is already going to be immune. We have about 30% that have gotten only one dose or gotten both of them. Full speed ahead, we give 2% of the population on any given day is getting a dose of the vaccine. Over 200,000, so actually more than 2% of the population any given day getting a shot. And it just seemed to happen seamlessly like that in a country where we're all so used to bureaucratic problems, to things not being efficient.
Yeah.
Our health maintenance organizations, take your hat off for them, take your kippah off for them. They've done a fantastic job. We're leading the world, and it's obviously very exciting. And our supply from Pfizer is going to be cut next week, the same as the European supply is. So that'll slow us down by at least a little bit, but still full speed ahead here. I think people here in some ways in shock and awe by just how well it's going. Again, of course, there are problems on the margins, but it's small potatoes. Overall, people are thrilled with how the vaccine drive's going.
Great. So Benjamin Netanyahu is also getting political immunity for the upcoming elections. This is the vaccination drive.
That's what he wants. And listen, no question, he's made the vaccines a big part of his campaign. He gets a picture taken with the 1 millionth person to get a vaccine, with the 1.5 millionth person to get a vaccine, with the 2 millionth person to get a vaccine. Vaccines have been a big part of the campaign, although a bit less so in the last week. We could talk about why. So he has definitely put this front and center. He's definitely making the most out of it politically. Netanyahu's problem is that he thought he was going to be getting an election on March 23rd, which is when our elections are. That was essentially post-pandemic. That was once we already had reached herd immunity because of the vaccinations, that most or all of the economy would have been opened up, and then he would ride in on the white horse and get credit for it electorally. The problem for him is, of course, the reality is more complicated. We have the British variant of the virus, which is making it much, much harder to bring infection numbers down, meaning that we have our lockdowns continue to be extended. It looks pretty unrealistic that most of the economy will be open by election day. And also the big wild card, of course, are these other variants where we're not sure how well the vaccines are going to work. And of course, everyone's big fear is here, especially after having so much success in the vaccine drive and investing so much in it, that at the end of the day, the virus is going to fool us all and have the last laugh by having some kind of variant that's at least partially resistant to the vaccine. So we're all hoping that won't happen. The government has completely shut down or almost completely shut down our international airport. You need to go before a committee to be able to fly in or out. All commercial flights have been stopped as a way of trying to bar the door from the variants. But again, how long will we keep the airport closed? What's already gotten through the barn door? Those are the big open questions.
Yeah, they are big open questions. And this CCP virus, actually, the Chinese Communist Party's virus, has actually infected everybody, including Trump and common people. So everybody is feeling the pinch of that. And Mr. Netanyahu is trying that he should get the immunity while his opponents must get the symptoms of the vaccine.
Listen, there's no question that the prime minister saw the vaccines as part of his election campaign and pushed for them. It's fair to reason, maybe in part because of the election campaign, although independently of that, just on the merits, obviously, getting vaccines is really important. And way to go
Yes.
to Prime Minister Netanyahu for being so energetic on that and doing it. But again, this is a case where the public interest is consistent with Netanyahu's personal political interest. Democracy is really working in this case,
Yeah,
right?
democracy
Because
is
his
working there.
interest is our interest, getting
Yeah.
every bottle of vaccine into the country, getting it into our arms quickly, and obviously everybody's thrilled with how it's going.
So let me tell you in Israeli terms, I mean, the Israeli political terms, he might be wishing that 1+1, one interest is yours, one interest is theirs, his. So his party Likud should get 11. 1+1 must be 11 in terms of percentage of votes.
I think he's probably hoping for a little bit more than that, but one step at a time.
So how is the economy, by the way, Owen?
It's in bad shape as economies are everywhere. Our numbers, at least as of a month or two ago, were better than numbers in some other parts of the world. But obviously, the economy here has taken a huge hit. We've had a lockdown now going on, depending on how you look at it, a month, 2 to 3 weeks. It's set to be extended. Again, the opening of the economy is being pushed back. So obviously, a lot of people are suffering. Netanyahu is trying to put out another rescue package, but it's been complicated by the fact it's happening in the middle of an election campaign. So there's a caretaker government, so it's not clear which of those provisions can actually be passed legally. That's a big argument that's happening right now. And also it includes some direct grants and some checks. And those are very controversial here, just as they are in the United States. Is that the right way to have a package? So there's still a lot of debate about all of that.
Now, when coming to the politics, how's the condition of Likud, by the way, and personal condition of personal political situation of Bibi?
Right. Well, there are two ways of answering that. First is about Likud itself directly. And I think all things considered, Likud's holding its own in the polls. The most recent poll gave Likud 29 seats in the Knesset out of 120. That's down from where that they have been, but it's not out of the range of where Likud has been historically. So given the state of the pandemic and how unhappy a lot of people are about the management of the pandemic, again, people happy about the vaccines, but not happy about the rest, that's not a bad result for Likud. The issue is, Gulrez, and this is the second way of answering the question, in Israeli politics, it is about the party, but it's also about the bloc. It's about to what extent does Netanyahu have a real chance of getting 61 members of Knesset to be part of a coalition so that he can form the coalition. And there it's touch and go. We have three possible scenarios in the election. One is Netanyahu forms the coalition. The other is that Netanyahu's rivals band together, and whichever of those parties is the largest, that person would presumably be prime minister. And that those rivals, which are a motley crew of right-wing, centrist, and even left-wing, that they form the government. That's option number two. Option number three is we don't have any government be formed. We go back to another set of elections, which, as you know, has already happened a whole bunch of times. And at this point, I think it's really touch and go between the three scenarios. Netanyahu's chances of forming a government are there. It depends on which poll you look at. It's very, very close. His rivals, depending on which parties they would be willing to put into their coalition, have a reasonable chance, you should say, of doing it. But also there is a chance of another stalemate and of a fifth election. That chance is definitely there.
God. And for a journalist like you, it will be a heavy thing.
Right. Well, for the journalists, it's actually great because we just get to talk about politics for months and months. But for the rest of the country, maybe not the optimal result, obviously.
But what about the court hearings? Because now the court hearings will go on and the eyewitnesses will be there and all those things will come into print as well as in television media. So won't it affect the Bibi's fortunes?
I think at this point, no. I mean, the first thing to say about the court hearings is they've been postponed for a variety of reasons, most recently because of the lockdown. So Netanyahu is supposed to be back in court, I think it's February 8th. But again, let's wait and see. The courts are open during the lockdown. That was a condition of Benny Gans, the alternative prime minister, Netanyahu's coalition partner. I don't know if we could use the word partner at this point, but part of Netanyahu's coalition. And so the courts have been open, but the judge on his own decided to push the hearing back because the lockdown, we'll see what the state of play is here February 8th. We may well still be in lockdown at that point. So again, open question about whether the hearing even happens then. I think at a broader level, the reality is this question has been asked and answered. The issue here has been litigated. The Israeli public over 3 elections has known what the prime minister's legal situation is and decided in any case to give him the number of seats in the Knesset that it did, giving him at least the pole position in most cases to form a government. Not necessarily, again, giving him the kind of government he wanted, but leaving him one way or another as prime minister. So I don't know that the legal case in a narrow sense is going to be a huge issue in these elections. And if you actually look carefully at what the rival parties are putting out, they are going hard at Netanyahu's personality and what they see as his failings and corruption, but they're not going at the legal cases specifically as much as they have in the past. And I think that that's no accident.
And how are the fortunes looking for Benny Gantz, because his party is already broken when he formed alliance with Netanyahu. Now, with what face he will face the public?
Yeah, he's definitely seen better political days. His party is right up, a blue and white party is right up against Israel's 3.25% electoral threshold, meaning that as in other parliamentary democracies, if you get in Israel, if you get 3.24999%, you get 0 seats. So you need to get that minimum number to even be back in the Knesset.
Yes.
In most polls, Gans is hitting that number, and he is back, but it's very, very close. And he doesn't seem to have any merger partners that he could potentially merge with and then be more safely above the threshold. They all basically said no in one way or another. So far, he's not dropping out. But the deadline to submit lists before the election is February 4th, so it's coming up. And at that point, we will know if Gantz is somehow against the odds going to merge with somebody. Again, doesn't look all that likely. If he's going to have his party run on its own and rolling the dice with the fact that they might not get into the Knesset at all, and in the process waste a lot of votes that could have gone to other parties that have similar positions and actually help the cause more than if they're essentially going to be thrown in the garbage, or if he'll drop out of the race, which also is possible. And again, in order to make sure that those votes go to other parties and aren't wasted and get to be used, get to have some kind of political dividend for them. So again, those are the choices facing Gantz. In the meantime, he's flexing his muscles. By the time viewers watch this, there may be more developments on this. But he is going up to the line, at least at this point, and basically threatening Netanyahu and the Likud in saying that if they don't have a bill to fine ultra-Orthodox schools, many of which have been open over the course of the pandemic and haven't really had enforcement against them, but if they don't have a real law with real teeth to enforce the lockdown against those schools, then he's not going to extend the lockdown at all, which is a kind of nuclear option. So anyway, viewers who are into the nitty-gritty of Israeli politics can look this up at the time when they're watching this. May have already been more developments. But this is a way, to make a long story short, of him trying to flex his muscles for his voters and try to get some more political traction by showing them that he's fighting. So we'll see.
Owen, what I think, it may divide the right-wing voters then. If he succeeds.
I'm sorry?
If Benny Gantz succeeds, and if lockdown is extended to the ultra-Orthodox Jewish schools also, then the right-wing voters will be divided, I think.
Well, first of all, you're getting at an important point. Obviously, that won't go over all that well with the ultra-Orthodox parties, the Haredi parties in the Knesset. They're fighting they're fighting to the end on this, and you can understand why. They actually should, to be fair, have made some compromises from their original position, but they're not interested in the kind of bill that Gantz is putting out. And Netanyahu absolutely must have their support. That's what's left of his coalition, in a sense, heading into the next election. So it's not an easy nut to crack. But again, there is a lot of resentment in wider sectors of the Israeli public about what is seen as special treatment for the ultra-Orthodox schools, and that may well be an issue. If we were voting tomorrow, it would be one of the main issues in the election. If you're voting on March 23rd, the question is, does the news cycle move on from this or not? And that we don't know. But there's at least a decent chance the news cycle doesn't move on. And we are still talking about this issue in March. And if that's the case, it could have a real impact on the elections.
Okay. And but it looks to me that altogether the right-wing house is a divided house right now, because that New Hope party, which is being formed by ex-minister of Netanyahu, I think he's also taking a chunk of vote.
You're right, Gulrez. You're up on the news, and you're up on Israeli politics. And way to go on that.
I love
Good
Israel.
for you. That's great. It's hard to follow. It's hurting cats all the time, but you're right. This is obviously one of the major developments in this election cycle, is Gidon Sa'ar and the New Hope party. And you're right. There are essentially two splits on the Israeli right, if you look this in a wider picture. One is on that issue of the ultra-Orthodox, of the Haredim, if you will, an older split that goes back a year or two. Politician Avigdor Liberman of a small party, but a right-wing party traditionally, that has made his name by saying to his voters, more important that you oppose the Haredim, oppose the ultra-Orthodox, than have a right-wing government. And he's gone to 3 election cycles on that and held his support. It's not a lot of people, but it's been enough to make a big impact on the math in forming a coalition. So that's one split. And the other split, of course, is around the issue of Netanyahu. You now have maybe more and more right-wingers who are saying it's more important to us as right-wingers to replace Netanyahu than it is to have a right-wing government. And that is at least part of Gideon Sa'ar's support. Those are definitely the voters he's going after. And it's a very important part of the dynamic here. And you're right, it's a big part of the reason why we keep having more and more elections. And it's one of the key things to watch, as we head toward election day.
And somehow it looks to me that even Liberman has lost the international press, because he was a darling of international press for any right reason or wrong reason. But he was a darling. But right now he is not in the international press. So what's the position of Liberman in the Israeli political circles?
I would describe Liberman as holding his own. He, after the breakdown, after the first election, he took a big risk by not going into the government and getting a sure senior ministry, because he would have been the deciding votes,
yes,
to determine whether there was a coalition. And instead rolled the dice by having this hardline approach against the ultra-Orthodox, against the Haredim, and going to his voters with that approach. And at the beginning, if you go way back to the days of 2019, the Likud, when this happened, was basically saying, we are going to destroy Liberman, we're going to eliminate him, we're going to go and convince all of his voters not to vote for him. That obviously hasn't happened. He's held his own, maybe even grown just a little bit. So he's still there as a player. He's not about to break out and have some massive growth in his support, but it doesn't look likely to disappear at all. He's holding his own. He's an important part of the math to any coalition that would want to be formed to oppose Netanyahu. He's obviously a very skilled and savvy politician, and he knows how to negotiate. And so if we get after March 23rd and there's a possibility of a not Netanyahu coalition being formed, Liberman's going to be a core part of that potentially, and he'll use, I'm sure, his negotiating leverage to the fullest.
And I think he also frequently have change of heart from right wing to center to somewhat left, then again right. He frequently have change of hearts, no?
It depends. It's a great point. It depends on the issue. And it goes to sort of one of the underlying issues in the election campaign. What does it mean to be right wing in Israel in 2021? What does it mean to be left wing? We're used in Israeli politics to talking about it along the lines of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yeah. And there, Liberman is certainly right wing. Nobody would accuse him of not being right wing. But you could argue that the definition of what it means to be right and what it means to be left is changing. And if that's the case, maybe Liberman is somewhere else. He explicitly defines his party as liberal and wants a liberal coalition. That's one of his main buzzwords. If you are liberal, then in Israel of 2021, maybe you're not right wing anymore. It's a question. I don't know that I have an answer. Yeah. It's one of the things that we're working through over the course of the election campaign, over the course of the last 2 years. But it's out there.
So I can tag it like status complicated.
That's for sure.
So what's the position of the Arab list?
I'm sorry?
Joint Arab list.
Well, the first question is, and again, those watching this conversation, especially a day or two from now, may be a lot smarter about this than I am. But the question is there going to be a joint list with all of those Arab parties forming one list? And that's up for open question now, because it's something else that's interesting we haven't talked about yet, which is that one of the parties forming that list, one of the 4, has basically threatened to strike out on its own, saying that it would potentially be interested in bargaining with Netanyahu and in going into a coalition with Netanyahu. Yeah. Exactly. On the idea that they would understand and go with eyes open that Netanyahu wouldn't agree with them on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they would be saying that's less important to us than getting budgets for Arab cities and Arab schools and Arab municipalities to change the regulations of housing and how to build housing. I have a real program to take on organized crime in the Arab sector, which is a huge issue. And that it threatens in some way split the joint list. Now, it's not a clean split, right? Because the vast majority of the joint list is still holding together. But this one splinter group could then strike out on its own, again, may or may not be able to get back into the Knesset on its own. It may not have the 3.25% that it needs, but it's an interesting phenomenon. At the same time, Netanyahu, pointedly over the course of the last month, has been pitching himself to Arab voters, for Arab voters to vote with the Likud. And reportedly, there's actually some polling data showing, in one poll that I saw, 15 or 20% of Arab voters could potentially vote for the Likud, which is really an amazing statistic if you think about it. But this has been a huge theme in Netanyahu's campaign to try to get votes for the Likud from the Arab sector, which, if he's able to do it in any number, even a small number, could make a big difference because it effectively moves Knesset seats from one block
Yes.
to the other, from one column to
One
the
block
other.
further. Yes.
Right, and that could have a real impact. So even if it's 2 seats, let's say, that could actually be really significant. So the issue of the future of the Joint Arab List is in some ways intertwined with this Likud campaign, and you could say deeper trends in the Arab sector and what Arab voters want and what's important to them and what their priority is. And that's a big issue that's at play here. So one thing to sort of tell viewers, an issue that they're familiar with, the normalization deals with the UAE and Bahrain. Around 72%, if I remember a poll correctly, of Arabs in Israel support the agreements. An overwhelming number.
Wow.
But in the Knesset,
Wow.
all of the members of the Joint Arab List voted against the agreements. So again, it shows that there's that gap on that issue that Netanyahu, of course, is going straight at, and maybe on other issues too. And that is one of the interesting things to watch. And we will be, again, a lot smarter on March 24th when we're looking at maps of the results to see how these different parties do in Arab towns.
Owen, what I can see from the social media is that there is a great bonhomie I can see between your Arab friends, especially United Arab Emirates. The daily exchanges you guys are having, it's great to watch. It's like you are having it with some European country.
It feels like a
European
miracle.
Counterpart, even better than them.
It feels like a miracle.
It's
it
like
really
a
is amazing. Every day brings something new, some kind of new headline on this, some kind of new. The most recent one today, as we're recording this, is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And there was a report about, obviously, given the pandemic, a meeting on Zoom or remotely between a Holocaust survivor here in Israel telling her story and having 200 people from the Gulf and from other parts of the Arab world watching.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, again, the opportunities this is opening up. The only question, whether it's been too much of a good thing, whether there were so many Israelis in December going to Dubai and coming home that they were actually part of what got this country sick and brought in all kinds of variants and mutants. So that's a big issue in our politics. For now, again, the airport is completely closed. Even when it reopens, there'll be a lot of scrutiny on the Dubai route.
Definitely.
But who knew that was going to be our problem in 2021? It's been a huge success.
Actually, I was shocked to know one thing. I was in a Zoom meeting and I was invited by some of my Bahraini friends. And one lady in the meeting, when I was introduced to her, she is an Bahraini Jew. I was not knowing that there are Jews in Bahrain. And they said there are Jews in Bahrain even.
Right. Well, I mean, listen, first of all, you're right. It's not that widely known. There are, it's a very small community. I think it's 20 or 30 families. Again, if I'm not mistaken. So at this point, very small. Again, there were at one point many more that left. But yeah, they're descendants of Iraqi Jews who came to Bahrain a few hundred years ago. Okay. And the family stayed, and they stayed throughout the whole Arab-Israeli conflict. And there's even a senior diplomat in the Bahraini Foreign Ministry who is Jewish. And obviously was thrilled when the normalization agreement happened. And as you know, also in the UAE, there are thousands of Jews. But of course, it's a different story. These are expats who have moved there in the last decade or two. So they're not, these aren't people with deep roots there, but still a few thousand people. And also don't forget Morocco and other of the countries we're normalizing with.
Yes, Morocco.
Around 5,000 Jews left in Morocco. And of course, that's a tiny fraction of the hundreds of thousands that were there. And I don't know what the number is of Israelis who have Moroccan ancestry, 800,000, 900,000. So the issue of the Jewish community in Morocco is going to be a huge issue as normalization between the countries moves forward.
Great. Okay, Owen, tell me one thing. When is Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel?
We're all waiting. Who knows? Obviously.
Because there are many things in the air. Lots of things in the air.
Oh, I mean, obviously, it would be incredible for Israel if that were to happen. I think there are 2 points of conventional wisdom, one on each side on this. Number one is the king is dead set against it, right? MBS, the crown prince, would do it tomorrow by all accounts, but the king is a lot more cautious, and at this point, he calls the shots. So if and when he were to pass away, and he is older, then that is thought to be something that could obviously move the process forward. On the other hand, there's another school of thought. It was, I think, Martin Indyk, again, a former U.S. ambassador to Israel and a Middle East policy hand of Democratic administrations, who had an interesting theory that because Biden administration is expected to have a harder line on Saudi Arabia, on arms sales to Saudi Arabia, on the
I was
Saudi
coming
war in
to that.
Yemen, on human rights,
Yeah.
on Khashoggi, etc., that this could be something that the Saudis could do to actually help enhance their status in Washington. And that's an
Yes.
interesting theory. It was interesting to see Martin Indyk come out with that explicitly. I did it a few months ago. I have no idea what he says today, but it's an interesting theory, and certainly a lot of people in Israel hoping it happens. But
Some
obviously with
people say
tremendous
that
risk.
Israeli politics, United Arab Emirates diplomacy, and Saudi money can do a lot of political stuff in Washington. Okay, but as a American-born Israeli, let me ask you, because you are someone who knows America well, and definitely you know Israel even better. So, what is the situation on the ground? What is the view on the ground in Israel, and especially within the administrative and governmental machinery of Israel, vis-a-vis the change of guard there in Washington?
Well, we're at the point where everybody is talking nice and in some ways talking around the potential problems. There are always the statements, which are true, of course, that Joe Biden has historically been a great friend of Israel, that there are key
Yes.
people in his administration who really understand Israel well and have a connection to it, whether it be Kamala Harris herself, whether it be Antony Blinken, the new Secretary of State,
Yes.
and others. So there is a sense that people here want to show goodwill. And I think for that matter, people in Washington want to show goodwill too. And there are certain issues where, frankly, it looks like the two sides are going to get along more or less. Maybe surprisingly, the Israeli Palestinian conflict, where Antony Blinken has come out and said, we're not going to start to have any major initiative on this. All we want you to do is not cause any harm, right? Not do any harm, not have any massive building and settlements, not have an annexation. Simply hold the situation as is. We're not going to be putting pressure, we in Washington, on Israel to agree to a new peace plan or to have some kind of talks. So that's certainly a position that the Israeli government may not agree with. It's not as favorable for them or for Israel, you could say, as were Trump's positions, but certainly something they can live with. The big one everyone's, of course, looking at is Iran, where, again, at this stage, everybody's talking nice. On the one hand, you have figures in Israel like the head of the military, the chief of staff Aviv Kochavi, who said yesterday, day before we're taping this, that re-entering the Iran nuclear deal would be bad, and even a deal with some minor alterations would be bad. It's a pretty frontal statement. But then you hear more people like Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi basically come out and say, we want to have dialogue with the Americans. You had Antony Blinken say the same thing, that you're going to consult with Israel and the Gulf states before making any moves on Iran. So everybody's at the stage of saying we want to listen to what the other side says, and we want to talk, and we want to understand. But some of there's going to be decisions made. And once there are decisions made, it's not at all clear that all of these sides, that the U.S. and Israeli governments, are going to agree on those decisions. And decisions are going to be made in Washington, not in Jerusalem. So obviously that could, at the end of the day, cause a lot of tensions. I think the hope is it won't be as ugly as it was under Obama, that it'll somehow be managed better,
Yes,
that
it
maybe
was
there'll be
very
some
bad.
concession to Israel. Certainly that Israel will be kept in the loop, not excluded from it as it was in 2013, for example. But at the end of the day, I think there's no avoiding that where Biden stands on Iran is completely fundamentally different than where Netanyahu, or for that matter, huge parts of the establishment and the public here stand on Iran. And there just may not be a way to square that circle. So, there's a real potential storm brewing. On the other hand, or maybe the third hand at this point, a lot of Iran experts will say, from the Iranian end, it's not easy. It's not so easy necessarily for them to come back into the nuclear deal. It's not so clear there's going to be an agreement between the U.S. and Iran on how a new nuclear deal or a re-enter nuclear deal should look. So it could break down between the U.S. and Iran rather than break down between the U.S. and Israel. possible scenario, but I think we have at least reasons to be cautiously pessimistic,
Yes.
frankly, in the medium term about what's going to happen in terms of relations between Biden and Netanyahu, even if, again, at this point, both sides really want to genuinely want to show goodwill and don't want things to break down.
And I think even for Biden, it is not the same Middle East which was there when he was vice president. It's a whole new set of situations when the Arab world, especially Saudi, Bahrain, and Saudi and group, I will say, not Saudi, but Saudi plus GCC and Israel are quite cozy. So he has new challenges and new
Well,
diplomacy
that's
will
a
be there.
really interesting point, and that's going to be one of the really interesting things to watch over the next few months. To what extent do Israel and the Gulf states coordinate publicly on the Iran issue? For example, 2015, we saw Benjamin Netanyahu go and give the now famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, speech before Congress. In the future, maybe it's not Netanyahu on its own. Maybe it's the ambassadors of Israel and multiple countries in the Gulf, certainly the UAE and Bahrain, which we've already normalized with. Maybe it's foreign ministers of those three countries together, even heads of state or heads of government of those countries together. Maybe there's some kind of public push that doesn't put Israel out there in front, but frames the issue totally differently. So it's not an issue about Israel, which is a lightning rod in American politics, okay, as it is in politics around the world. Maybe it's a different set of characters, a broader set of characters that, you're right, is harder to pigeonhole and is harder to brush aside. And that could well be one of the fruits of the normalization process. I'm personally very interested to watch that. Now, again, the conventional wisdom right now in Israel is we don't want public moves like that. Everything should be private. Everything should be friendly. Everything should be behind closed doors. But how long does that last?
So we always get to know a lot of things from you, Owen, and it was my pleasure to have you this month as well. And we are looking forward that we will. Many of our viewers, they ask that when is Owen coming India, and when can we meet him directly? So when are you
right
planning
now
for
our
India,
airport's
Owen?
closed, so I don't have too much of a chance right now. But listen, let's see how this virus does over the next few months,
No,
and how the SARS-CoV-2 virus does when it
going to
mutates.
kill the Chinese Communist Party virus.
Well, listen, we'll hope for the best, and obviously, I'd love to be back in India. It'd be a great chance to go,
No,
and obviously meet you in person.
We will call you in some literature festival.
Hey, there you go.
We will love to have you and interaction with you. So lots of love from India to you and your family
from Israel
and
too.
all Israelis.
Thanks so much, and from Israel too.
We will talk again next month on Israel.
Great. Looking forward.
Okay, Owen. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Have a great day.
You too.